Hello and welcome to lesson 5 about our site study of the Western Front. This lesson our title is How were wounded soldiers treated and transported? We're going to answer these two questions. What were the main stages of the chain of evacuation? What happened to wounded soldiers at each stage? And what was the role of the RAMC and FANY in dealing with wounded soldiers? For the connect activity, can you write down the words on the left hand side and then match them up with the correct description on the right hand side? So these are all from the previous lesson. Pause the video and do the connect. Okay, some key terms before we get going. On page 158 in the textbook is where we're starting, and there are facts there about the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, and the FANY, the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. So use the key terms box on page 158 to record facts about each group. There were also other medical services working on the Western Front. For example, St John's Ambulance that you may have heard of, they still exist today, often have their ambulances at school fairs or other sort of public fairs in the summer holidays. They all organised a hospital with volunteers and paid doctors, and they sent weekly reports to the War Office in London. This is a good source for historians. There were also, this is an example of their ambulance. There were also Queen Alexandra nurses. So there were only about 300 of these women when war broke out. They were only women, and over 10,000 by 1918, and actually 200 of them died on active service. They weren't fighting, but they maybe were caught in crossfire or shell fire. And the British Red Cross was also involved on the front line. So make sure you've jotted down the names of these three other groups and one detail about each of them. So use the key terms box to help you. Okay, let's have a quick look at doctors at war then. This is again on page 158. Use the table to write down the answer to the first question. How many medical officers, which means trained doctors, were there by 1918? You can see underneath in that table there are clearly lots more other ranks within the RAMC who were working to support the doctors. So just like if you went into hospital, it wouldn't just be a doctor who saw you, there'd be other people as well helping. That's also true in the RAMC. And then second question, what fraction of Britain's doctors served with the RAMC? You can see in the little paragraph underneath the table on page 158, it tells you that more than half of the doctors in Britain were serving with the RAMC on the Western Front during the war. Okay, let's have a look at one of the key sources that we use to help us know about the RAMC. It was written by a man called Brereton, and this map that you can see, or diagram that you can see in the textbook and here, was drawn by him. And he's showing us here that how the medical services were organised. Remember, that's one of our key questions. This is the front of his book. You can see this is a title page and it has a map in it. Paris, you might be able to see, is right down towards the bottom left-hand corner, and up near the top is Arras and Cambrai, both places that we have heard of already where the British Army were operating. And I just wanted to show you this. This is the author's note. So this is what he wrote at the start of his book. In presenting this narrative of the doings of the RAMC on the Western Front during the first 2 months of the Great War, I should like to express my grateful thanks to numbers of the officers of that corps, whose careful notes, taken at times of great pressure and written often under great stress and danger, have enabled me to set down what I hope will be considered a fair description of events. So this is really useful for us. Brereton is saying here where he got his information from, what he's writing about, and what he is trying to do. So he wants to describe things fairly. So when we look at sources from him or extracts from his book, we know what he's trying to do. Okay, let's have a look at the chain of evacuation then. Looking at this map, very similar hand-drawn map, the fighting is happening at the top of this picture. So you can see the 1st Division, 2nd Division, this is the army on the front line, and then all the red part is the bit that is organised by the RAMC. So the chain of evacuation starts nearest to the front line. You can see the RAP, which stands for the Regimental Aid Post. We'll come back to this, but for now just write, like you can see in the yellow box, RAP is the first place that soldiers would be taken to if they were wounded. We then have the ADS and the MDS, Advanced Dressing Station and Main Dressing Station. And these, again, we'll find out a bit more about in a minute. The stretcher bearers would be carrying men to these places. Further back, you can see here the Casualty Clearing Station, CCS. And you can also see that at this point, you would be being moved along here by an ambulance train in this map, or possibly by motorised ambulances like we were talking about last time. The last place on here to notice is the base hospital here, and then from here, so this is still in France or Belgium, here's the sea, and here is the hospital ship carrying you back to Britain, and then back in Britain you would be transferred to another hospital. We'll read a source about that later, the home hospital here. So this is the chain of evacuation from the Regimental Aid Post nearest to the front line, through to the advanced and the main dressing stations, through to the Casualty Clearing Station, the hospital, across the sea back to Britain to the home hospital. Now, not everybody would be able to go, would go right the way back. So depending on your injury, you might be treated at the Regimental Aid Post and then go back up to the front line. Or, as you can see here, you might be moved back to a Casualty Clearing Station and then go back to the front line after you've been treated at a Casualty Clearing Station. So at any point on this chain of evacuation, you can be turned around. Okay, let's have a look at some sources. This source is a helpful one talking about the chain of evacuation. Pause the video and read this carefully. An orderly was somebody who basically was helped doctors to do their job. So not medically trained, or not very strongly medically trained, certainly they weren't doctors, but they were there to help. So have a read of this source, and then on the next slide there are some questions. Once you've read it, you might need to switch backwards and forwards to this slide so that you can find the answers. So this man is actually working in London when he's writing. So pause the video and answer these 7 questions. Have a go at question 7. This is a bit more interesting question, a thinking question, than just a comprehension question. This source is also in the textbook on page 159, if that's easier to see. This source is not in the textbook, but it's one that we are going to evaluate for how useful it is. So our inquiry, our question is, what was the system of transport like for wounded soldiers? And here we have got a source from a book, and it's explaining what happened and why. So like we did last lesson, can you write down a couple of points about the content, what it says, the caption, which is the bit of writing above the source, and using your contextual knowledge. So you might want to say there, I know that there were many different medical units, for example, advanced dressing stations for that part. Then write a paragraph explaining how that source is useful. So pause the video and write that paragraph. Okay, let's look at in a bit more detail then at some of these places on the chain of evacuation. So the first place is a Regimental Aid Post. So write that as a subheading. And then on page 59, there's some information. So you can set this out as bullet point notes rather than a spider diagram if you prefer. So make sure you have got written down about where Regimental Aid Post was situated, who was there, who was working there, what was it and why was it there, what was it there to do. And then have a go at answering this question. Remember, name a feature and add a description, add detail, name another feature and add a detail. The next place is a dressing station, and this is a picture of a dressing station that during the war became reinforced concrete bunkers. This place is called Essex Farm. It was an advanced dressing station, so it's really quite near the front line. And on this map here you can see Ypres at the bottom, or Wipers here. So this is the town of Ypres. The front line is over to this side, and the British Army are stationed here. This part here is a canal, so that's water. And these numbers here, these lines here, for example, this one here, number 4, is a bridge. These are bridges across the canal. And so you can see Essex Farm, ADS is just here. And you can see behind it there's a train line. The reason for that is, like we can see on the diagram here, is that very often there were train lines quite close to advanced dressing stations. So this one obviously doesn't quite fit the map because this is an ADS, and yet it has got this train track very close to it. So you can see here that there were concrete bunkers. You can see visitors, people coming to this today. There's also a cemetery there where a very young soldier who was 15 years old when he was killed. So this is a popular place for visitors to go who are interested in looking at the First World War. 10 medical officers would have been here, stretcher bearers would have brought men to here. There were some nurses here, and on the longest anybody would stay here would be 7 days. If it was longer than that, you would probably need to be moved further back up the chain of evacuation, and you would be going to the nearest casualty clearing station. On page 160, there is lots of information about casualty clearing stations. So use this to help you answer the questions on this page. So pause the video and answer the questions about casualty clearing stations. Just for interest, this is a plan of a casualty clearing station quite late on in the war in 1917. All of these rectangles are tents. So you can see, for example, that this is a resuscitation ward here, but there are 4 marquees, that means 4 tents. You can see around the edges, for example, this is where the cooking is done. This is a bathhouse here. So this is an extremely well organised casualty clearing station. And you can see it was able to accommodate 600 patients. So it's made out of tents, but it could accommodate 600 patients. So it's basically like a hospital, as big as a hospital by 1917. Okay, on page 161, there's some information, a bit more information about the role of the FANY, and there's also a link to a very short video about their role. So on this, just do a quick mind map or bullet point notes about the role of the FANY on the Western Front. And lastly, we're going to look at base hospitals. This is on page 162 in the textbook. There are 6 statements here. All of them have got mistakes in. So for example, you need to find and correct the mistakes. So for example, the first one says base hospitals were near the coast, so men could go to the beach. Now, you can probably work out already that that wasn't the reason why they were near the coast, and it was really because it was so that they could be transported back to Britain easily if that's what needed to happen. So use the text on that first column on page 162 to help you answer these questions. And the hospital at Arras, the base hospital at Arras, was a particularly sort of special hospital, and the reason was that it was underground. And on page 162 and 163 there's some information there, and you can see in the painting. So again, have a go this time just straight off answering this question, describing 2 features of the hospital at Arras. We know the first thing we need to do is name a feature, and then we add a detail or a description in our second sentence. Okay, well done for getting through this lesson. To consolidate, close your book and draw your own version of the chain of evacuation, adding in as much detail as you can about the different people and the different roles that would happen in each place. Well done.